I want you to imagine, just for a second, a world where the biggest looming crisis isn't overpopulation.
Right, not a planet that's bursting at the seams with too many people.
Exactly. It's not about having too many people and, not enough resources. Instead, imagine a sudden, drastic shrinking of humanity.
Which is pretty wild considering what we're used to hearing.
Yeah, I mean, for decades, we've all been warned about this population bomb, right? This idea that human growth is just this unstoppable exponential curve that will eventually break the Earth.
But if you actually look at the data today, it tells a completely different story.
It really does.
It tells the story of a demographic crash course that, honestly, almost no one is fully prepared for.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into an incredible stack of source material to figure out what's really happening.
We've got some heavy hitters today.
We do. We're looking at the UN's World Population Prospects for 2024, a major forecasting study published in The Lancet by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation.
Also known as the IHME.
Right, the IHME. Plus, we've got some historical demographic data and this fascinating paper by Kevin Koberguk on the, frankly, very unexpected environmental impacts of population decline.
And our mission here is to really unpack this whole demographic transition.
Yeah, how we got here and where we're going.
Exactly. We're looking at how humanity went from taking, roughly 300,000 years to reach 1 billion people to suddenly adding 7 billion more in just 2 centuries.
Which is just a staggering acceleration when you say it out loud.
It is. But more importantly, we need to understand why our global population is now actively decelerating toward contraction.
And for you listening, this matters because this shift is going to fundamentally rewrite the global economy.
Oh, absolutely.
It's going to reshape geopolitical power, and it will directly impact the tax bases, the labor markets, and the very cities that you live and work in.
It touches literally everything.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp this coming decline, we first have to recognize the historical whiplash we just lived through.
Because what we consider normal human growth is actually a total historical anomaly.
Right. For the vast majority of human existence, population growth was, well, practically flat.
Yeah, if we go back to around 9000 BC, there were about 8 million hunter-gatherers on the entire planet.
Just 8 million.
Just 8 million. And high birth rates were completely offset by massive, devastating mortality rates. It was a constant balancing act just to keep the species going.
And it took all of human history, literally right up until the year 1804, for us to finally hit that first 1 billion milestone.
And then came the whiplash.
Yeah, just 218 years later, on November 15, 2022, we crossed the 8 billion mark.
That unprecedented explosion was driven by what demographers call the first demographic transition. It started in late 18th century Europe.
That was when things like sanitation, basic medicine, and food security started improving, right?
Exactly. Mortality rates, especially for infants and children, just plummeted. People were suddenly surviving childhood.
But the wild part is, birth rates didn't just automatically drop the moment medicine improved.
No, they didn't. Culturally, people were still operating on that ancient evolutionary survival strategy.
Having large families because, for centuries, half your kids wouldn't make it to adulthood.
Right. It took generations for societal norms to naturally adjust downward. And in that temporal gap where deaths were plummeting but births were still incredibly high, the population absolutely exploded.
But that explosion actually peaked a long time ago.
Yeah, the demographic apex of acceleration, the highest rate of human growth in our history, was actually back in 1964.
Wow, 1964.
Yep, we were growing at 3.2% a year back then. Since then, the rate has been steadily slowing down.
But here's where the current forecasting models start to really diverge from each other.
They do. The UN projects that our population will peak at 10.3 billion around the year 2084.
And they heavily rely on a concept called population momentum.
Exactly.
I always think of population momentum like a speeding freight train.
That's a great way to look at it.
If you're driving this massive heavy train and you suddenly cut the engine, which in this demographic scenario means fertility rates drop, the train doesn't just stop on a dime.
Not at all.
The sheer mass of the train, which is the 2 billion women of reproductive age currently on the planet, just keeps it rolling forward for miles before it eventually grinds to a halt.
But the researchers at IHME, the ones who published that forecasting model in The Lancet, they look at that same speeding train and argue the brakes are going to engage much faster.
So they see an earlier peak.
Yeah, their model projects the population will peak earlier, in 2064 at 9.7 billion, and then actually shrink to 8.8 billion by the end of the century.
That's a pretty significant difference from the UN numbers.
It is. They argue that the UN is underestimating how rapidly universal female education and access to modern contraception will drive global fertility rates down.
When we look at these competing models, they often seem to be arguing over, like, fractions of a decimal point.
It can definitely seem like splitting hairs.
Yeah, it begs the question of whether a difference of, say, zero point 0.1 births per woman really matters that much in the grand scheme of things.
What's fascinating here is just how mathematically sensitive human population growth is over time.
Really? How so?
A divergence of just zero point 0.1 in the total fertility rate, so literally 1/10 of a child per woman on average, translates to 500 million more or fewer people on Earth by the year 2100.
Wait, 500 million people based on a fraction of a statistical child?
Exactly. It is a staggering variance based on a tiny, tiny shift in human behavior.
Wow. So if the first demographic transition was about us finally surviving childhood, the second demographic transition seems to be about a fundamental shift in our life choices.
That's the perfect way to frame it.
Why exactly are we globally, as a species, just deciding to stop having kids?
Well, the second demographic transition, or SDT, represents a complete inversion of how we think about family planning.
How so?
In the past, contraception was primarily used to stop having large families, to prevent unwanted pregnancies once a couple already had 3 or 4 kids.
Right, you hit your limit and then try to stop.
Exactly. But under the SDT, couples now have to actively choose to stop using contraception in order to initiate a pregnancy.
So procreation shifts from being this biological default to a highly deliberate, often heavily delayed choice.
Precisely.
And sociologists link this to cultural postmodernity and this concept called the Maslowian preference drift.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but the concept makes sense.
Basically, as our fundamental material needs for food and shelter are met by modern economies, our values shift upward.
Upward toward individual autonomy, self-actualization, and gender egalitarianism.
Right, and marriage and procreation just decouple from each other. They are no longer a mandatory package deal for a successful life.
The most powerful driver of this global decline, though, is female empowerment. Specifically, universal female education.
That makes total sense.
When a society educates women, it naturally delays the age of marriage, delays the birth of a first child, and directly lowers the desired family size.
The sources had a really striking example of this with Niger.
Oh, yes. Niger currently has one of the highest fertility rates in the world.
But projections show that if they achieve universal female education by 2030, their 2050 fertility rate drops from 5.0 children per woman all the way down to 2.7.
Education literally rewrites the demographic destiny of a nation.
It's incredible. But, I have to push back here a little bit.
Go for it.
Framing this purely as a sociological choice, like it's just about career versus family, or preferring travel over changing diapers, it kind of ignores the biological reality in the research.
That's a very fair point.
Because humans naturally have pretty low fecundity to begin with. We only have about a 20 to 30% chance of conception per ovulation cycle.
Right, because human infants are neurologically complex. They require immense caloric energy and years of intensive care.
So we naturally evolved to have a lower conception rate compared to other mammals.
Exactly. We invest heavily in fewer offspring.
But add to that baseline the fact that modern environmental toxicants are actively degrading our biological machinery.
It's a huge problem.
Endocrine disruptors, microplastics, industrial pollutants, these are demonstrably lowering global sperm counts and degrading ovarian reserves.
The environmental data is pretty alarming.
And we rely so heavily on assisted reproductive technology, like IVF, but RT is essentially a high-tech detour around a crumbling bridge.
It masks the underlying biological decline.
Exactly. We are systematically delaying parenthood to an age where natural fertility is already lower, and combining that with environments completely saturated in reproductive toxicants.
And the medical establishment's focus is almost entirely on profitable, invasive fertility treatments.
Rather than addressing or preventing the environmental exposure causing the biological degradation in the first place.
It's a classic case of treating the symptoms, not the cause.
For sure. Now, before we look at how governments are reacting to this demographic crash, we should probably clarify the baseline metric, the 2.1 replacement rate.
Yes, that number gets thrown around a lot.
A lot of people wonder why the replacement rate isn't just 2.0, 2 kids to replace 2 parents.
It seems like basic math, right?
Right. But demographers factor in that extra 0.1 to account for infant and child mortality. basically ensuring the population mathematically breaks even.
And right now, over half the countries on Earth are plunging below that 2.1 threshold.
So governments are understandably panicking. They're trying to buy their way out of the problem, and it is largely failing.
South Korea is the ultimate case study here.
Yes, they hit a record low fertility rate of 0.72 in 2023.
Which is the most extreme demographic contraction in peacetime history.
It's just wild.
And it's the result of immense policy whiplash over a few short decades.
The history there is intense. Between the 1960s and 1980s, the South Korean government was terrified of overpopulation stifling their economic growth.
Right, so they pushed aggressive antinatalist policies, even going so far as to encourage forced sterilizations and abortions.
And the birth rate utterly collapsed. By 2005, it hit 1.08, and the government completely panicked and reversed course.
They've spent over 280 trillion won since 2006 trying to incentivize people to have kids.
We're talking about massive cash allowances, subsidized childcare, housing priorities.
And despite all that money, the rate kept dropping down to that 0.72.
Tomographers point to institutional gender incoherence as the culprit there, right?
Yes. In South Korea, women have achieved high individual equity. They have equal access to higher education and competitive corporate workplaces.
But the society retains exceptionally low family-oriented equity.
Exactly. The corporate culture demands brutal, rigid, long hours, while traditional norms still expect women to shoulder almost all the intensive domestic labor, elder care, and mothering.
It's an impossible structural conflict.
Faced with an unwinnable scenario, women are simply opting out of marriage and childbearing entirely.
It's like offering someone a one-time signing bonus for a job that requires 80 hours a week for the rest of your life, with no vacation time and zero support from management.
That is a perfect analogy.
I mean, you can throw all the cash you want at people, but if the structural reality of the job is miserable, no one is taking the signing bonus.
Which raises an important question. What happens when a government goes all in on financial pronatalism, bypassing structural reform for pure financial reward?
We see this unfolding in Hungary right now.
We do. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has made boosting the birth rate a massive national priority.
They're spending something like 5 to 6% of their entire GDP on family subsidies.
It's a massive financial commitment.
We're talking tax exemptions for life if a mother has 4 kids, and entirely forgiven home loans.
And for a brief moment, it looked like a triumph. Their rate went from 1.25 up to 1.59.
But I was looking at the Hungarian data from the sources, and it became clear that this was largely a statistical illusion.
Yes, it's something called the tempo effect.
Can you explain the tempo effect? Because women weren't necessarily having more children over their entire lifetimes, right?
Exactly. They were just having them sooner to lock in the massive financial benefits. The tempo effect creates a temporary spike in the annual birth rate by shifting the timing of pregnancies.
Right, but it rarely changes the completed cohort fertility.
Yeah.
Like the total number of kids a woman actually has by the end of her reproductive years.
Spot on. And we are seeing the reality of that tempo effect fading in Hungary now. By 2025, their rate had dropped back down to 1.31.
The sources also point out a massive design flaw in the Hungarian model, its selective nature.
Yes, the policy design is very telling.
It was explicitly engineered to benefit middle to high income, traditional married couples,
while completely excluding socially disadvantaged groups, single mothers, and non-traditional families.
You cannot meaningfully raise a national birth rate by deliberately excluding a massive portion of your population from the support structures.
Contrast that approach with the Nordic countries. They funnel their resources into universal services.
Like widely available, affordable childcare and heavily subsidized shared parental leave.
Right, rather than just handing out tax exemptions. Their birth rates are still declining due to the broader second demographic transition, but they are much more stable and structurally sound.
And then Eastern Europe faces an even more complex challenge, which the sources call the brain drain.
It's a really tough cycle to break. Even if aggressive policies do manage to create a few more births, if those young people grow up and migrate to Western Europe for better wages, the net population gain for the home country remains zero.
So if throwing billions of dollars at the problem in wealthy nations isn't moving the needle, the global center of gravity has no choice but to shift to the places where the demographic transition hasn't fully hit yet.
Which completely redraws the global map.
Right now, 63 countries have already peaked and are actively shrinking.
But 126 will continue growing, and the shakeup in the top 10 most populous countries is wild.
India has already officially surpassed China.
And China is looking down the barrel of a massive absolute loss, potentially losing around 700 million people by the year 2100.
That's almost unfathomable. 700 million people.
It's a completely different demographic reality. And historic geopolitical heavyweights like Russia and Japan are projected to drop out of the top 10 entirely.
They will be replaced by countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, and Ethiopia.
The map is shifting south.
The statistic that genuinely stopped me in my tracks was about the geographic distribution of newborns.
It's a powerful data point.
By the year 2100, sub-Saharan Africa will account for 54% of all live births on the planet. Over half.
Just think about what that means for global economics.
If you're listening and wondering why your local taxes keep going up, why your city's public services seem to be getting worse, you are experiencing the early stages of secular stagnation.
Secular stagnation is the macroeconomic result of an inverted age pyramid.
Basically, you have a shrinking base of young workers paying income taxes, trying to support an exploding population of elderly people.
Exactly. Elderly populations who consume disproportionate, massive amounts of healthcare and state pensions.
The math just doesn't work.
It doesn't. That leads to high public debt, weak consumer demand for new infrastructure, and chronically low economic growth.
It also completely reframes how nations handle immigration.
It moves from being a highly polarized, toxic political debate to an absolute cutthroat macroeconomic necessity.
Right. High-income shrinking nations aren't going to be building walls. They're going to be engaging in a fierce, competitive global bidding war.
They will have to actively court a shrinking pool of young, skilled labor from the global south just to keep their hospitals running, their logistics chains moving, and their military staffed.
We are entering the era of strategic migration.
Nations that fail to attract and integrate global talent will simply see their domestic economies hollow out.
But wait, I have to bring up a counter-argument from the sources to all this economic doom and gloom.
Okay, let's hear it.
Doesn't a shrinking labor pool mean workers finally have the upper hand? There's a demographer in the research, O'Sullivan, who has a fascinating labor market hypothesis.
Right. O'Sullivan's perspective is really interesting.
Standard economics assumes fewer workers equals a massive recession. But O'Sullivan argues that a contracting labor supply creates a profoundly tight labor market.
O'Sullivan points out that when workers are scarce, employers lose their leverage. They suddenly have to compete fiercely for your labor.
They are forced to raise wages, offer better benefits, and improve working conditions to retain staff.
So wealth inequality could actually decrease.
And because human labor becomes so expensive, businesses are forced to innovate to survive.
Instead of relying on cheap labor, they have to invest massive capital into automation, AI, and labor-saving tech.
Which drives up overall productivity. A smaller, older society could theoretically maintain incredible per capita wealth if they manage the transition smartly and automate the right sectors.
That's the optimistic economic view. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, though, there is a massive ecological collision course we are ignoring when we talk about the benefits of a shrinking population.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because a lot of people look at population decline and think, isn't a shrinking population exactly what the planet needs right now to fight climate change?
It seems highly intuitive. Fewer people means fewer carbon emissions, less resource extraction, less pollution.
Yeah, it sounds like a win for the environment.
But Kevin Kurek's paper thoroughly debunks this idea of a depopulation dividend.
It really just comes down to a fundamental mismatch in our timelines, doesn't it?
Exactly. To prevent catastrophic climate change and keep global warming under critical thresholds, global carbon emissions need to hit net zero by the year 2050.
But because of population momentum, that speeding freight train we talked about earlier, the actual absolute drop in human numbers won't meaningfully take effect until the late 21st century.
By the time depopulation actually eases the burden on natural resources, we will have already breached the critical ecological tipping points.
The timeline simply doesn't sync up to save us.
Furthermore, to actually hit net zero by 2050, we have to execute a massive, historically unprecedented green transition.
We need to construct immense carbon capture plants, rebuild entire national renewable energy grids, expand nuclear power, and fortify climate-resilient infrastructure.
And all of that requires massive, front-loaded capital investments.
Right. You can't build a new global energy grid without massive tax revenues.
Yeah.
And you certainly can't build it without a massive, dynamic labor force of scientists, engineers, and heavy construction workers.
But if you are in a society experiencing rapid depopulation and secular stagnation, your tax base is shrinking and your physical labor pool is vanishing.
Green infrastructure becomes economically and politically much harder to build and sustain when a country is just struggling to pay for its elderly care.
It's a huge blind spot. This also creates a bizarre paradox on a local level, something urban planners call the spatial transit and urban decay paradox.
I like to think of this one like living in a giant 10-bedroom mansion.
Okay, let's unpack the mansion analogy.
If you have 10 people living there, everyone chips in $100 for the heating bill and roof repairs.
Makes sense.
But if 8 people move out, the physical footprint of the house doesn't get any smaller.
Right, the house is still the same size.
You still have to heat the whole place, you still have to fix the roof when it leaks, but now you only have a fraction of the income to cover those fixed costs.
That is the exact mathematical trap of public infrastructure. Things like municipal water grids, sewage systems, and especially public transit have incredibly high fixed costs.
So as rural areas and suburbs depopulate, the per capita cost for the people left behind skyrockets.
Municipalities simply can't afford the maintenance, so they're forced to cut services. They reduce the bus routes. They shut down the regional train lines.
And when you cut public transit, what do the remaining people do? They get back into their private gas-powered cars.
Which means per capita greenhouse gas emissions actually increase in a shrinking town.
It is the exact opposite of what the depopulation dividend promises.
The ultimate takeaway from analyzing all this data is that the 21st century is no longer about managing exponential human growth.
We are crossing a threshold.
We are. The future is entirely about learning how to navigate structural depopulation.
Trying to bribe people with cash to have more kids obviously won't work.
No. True success is going to require a massive societal shift away from financial prenatalism toward genuine structural gender equity.
Right, building workplaces and societies that actually value, accommodate, and support caregiving without penalizing the caregiver.
It also means accepting strategic immigration not as a political failing, but as an absolute non-negotiable economic necessity.
And for our cities, it means embracing the paradigm of smart shrinkage.
Instead of sprawling outward, municipalities will have to proactively resize their infrastructure.
That means intentionally dismantling unused roads, consolidating neighborhoods, and turning abandoned lots into green spaces to reduce maintenance costs.
Exactly, maintaining the quality of life for the people who remain without relying on the Ponzi scheme of endless growth.
This transition isn't some abstract demographic theory. It's the structural reality that will shape your future career path.
It really is.
It will dictate the long-term investments you make, the leverage you have to negotiate higher wages in a shrinking labor pool, and the taxes you will inevitably pay to support an aging society.
The world is fundamentally rebalancing. The nations, corporations, and cities that adapt to the reality of a smaller, older population will thrive.
While those that try to force the old 20th century models of endless exponential growth will inevitably fracture.
Well said.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that really builds on Kuruk's environmental paper.
Oh, this is a great point.
He mentions how older voting blocs might lose the political resolve to fund long-term, future-oriented projects because, quite frankly, their temporal horizons are shorter.
Sobering thought.
Which makes you wonder if innovation, risk-taking, and massive cultural revolutions have historically always been driven by massive, restless youth generations pushing against the status quo. What happens to human psychology, art, and the very concept of the future when the vast majority of our society is elderly, looking backward rather than forward?
Will a shrinking world also inevitably mean a less imaginative one?
It's a huge question. Keep questioning the numbers, keep looking at the data, and thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us today. We'll catch you next time.